Welcome everyone to the July 25th, 2024 meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. A link has been provided on the commission website for the public to view this meeting. Hayden, would you mind calling or taking a roll call of the commissioners?
Commissioner Griscom?
Here.
Commissioner Richards?
Here.
Chair Patterson?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thanks, Hayden. The School Performance and Accountability Committee will hear several presentations from staff today. First, Deputy Director of Authorizing Maggie Lund and Data and Accountability Coordinator Rebecca Letterber.
Close enough.
We'll be presenting the school year 23-24 wrap-up, and then following their presentation, we'll hear a school year 24-25 preview from Director of Authorizing Beth Figueroa and Authorizing Coordinator Trent Carlson. And finally, the Director of School Programs and Supports, Nate Parker, and Exceptional Education Coordinator Katie Bridges will present the school year 24-25 Special Populations Plan. Do commissioners have any comments on the agenda before we vote to approve?
No. Move to submit.
Second.
Those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it and the agenda is approved. The minutes from the committee meeting that was held on March 21st, 2024 have been provided in advance. Does anyone have any edits or comments to make regarding the prior minutes before we proceed? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes, or opposed? The ayes have it.
Voted twice.
The ayes have it
Stacking
and the
the
minutes
outcomes.
are approved. Okay, so the first item is the school year 23-24 wrap-up from Deputy Director of Authorizing Maggie Lund and Data and Accountability Coordinator Rebecca Letterber. Close again.
You'll get it one day.
All right. Maggie and Rebecca, you are recognized.
Thank you, Commissioner Patterson. I'm excited to provide you kind of a preliminary update to some data and information that we have from our last school year. So we'll start with somewhat of a portfolio overview from school year 23-24. So up on the screen, you'll see the schools that were served for this past school year. We had 6 schools in Memphis and 7 in Nashville. 2 were high schools within the commission portfolio. We have Bluff City High School that's located in Memphis, and we have Kip Antioch Global High School, which had opened this past year, serving grade 9. We had 7 elementary schools and 4 middle schools, and in total last year we served roughly 4,700, almost 4,800 students. What you're looking at now is a comparison when looking at subgroup percentages, and this is looking overall at the district. Now, I want to note a couple things on this slide. First, this is a lagging year. District level data is not available yet at this time for last school year, so I think it's still important to put up this information though and talk about it and kind of ground ourselves in the percentages of subgroups served. This is something that we focused on pretty heavily last year with the work of Commissioner Tucker, and just wanted to kind of look as, you know, an informational gut check, if you will, as to like where we're falling in comparison with the districts in which our schools are located. So first I want to start off by grounding us in what these acronyms mean. I know we throw a lot of acronyms around. So BHN is the Black, Hispanic, and Native American subgroup. ED is economically disadvantaged. EL is English learner, or often we will refer to them as English language learner as well. And then SWD is students with disabilities. So here you can see kind of across the board as a district, we are roughly on par with the resident districts in which our schools are located. One thing that I will note is looking to the next slide, we've got a comparison here of our breakdown of schools, and so this slide is looking at Memphis. Here you can see something that is a bit of an outlier here is Cornerstone Prep School. So I'm going to talk through a couple specific indicators there. The first is that they only served grades K1 last year, and you'll notice that there's a very high population of students with disabilities and EL students. Part of this is just solely because there was a small number of kids overall, and so their percentages were somewhat skewed by that number. So do want to call that out, that we're really with those percentages only talking about roughly a handful of kids. Another call out I want to make is Libertas. Libertas serves a proportionally larger amount of students with disabilities at 20.7%. That is truly higher than the local district and high even within the commission. And wanted to note with some context here about Leicester Prep, Promise Academy, Spring Hill, and Libertas. They're all located within a similar area of Memphis and serve a very similar proportion of EL students, which is quite low, and that is not atypical for schools in that area of the district. I'll move now into Nashville. One thing I failed to mention on the previous slide is I do want to again reiterate the lagging year here. So the district data that is there is from the year prior, solely because we do not have updated district data at this point in time for last school year. So when looking at Nashville, we have the same comparison here, same context conversation. KIPP Antioch Global High School, they only served grade 9, so kind of a similar situation with CPS is that we're talking about a handful of kids in that scenario. I also want to call out our schools within the Antioch area of Nashville. They have a higher percentage of EL students served there. That's KIPP Collegiate Prep Elementary, NCP, Nashville Collegiate Prep, and Rocket Ship, Dream. Their percentages are on par with other schools within that area. So that is pretty typical. I know in the past, students with disabilities, as I mentioned, have been an ongoing conversation when we're looking at those percentages. And I think the headline here when looking at this data across the last 3 slides is really to say that we are pretty consistent with what we're seeing in schools in the area and in comparison to the resident district, which is great. I think that demonstrates that our schools are utilizing equitable recruitment practices, creating welcoming environments for students, and it's what we want to see. And now, we will kind of pivot a bit and look at some preliminary assessment data based on last year's TCAP results. So this is for school year 23-24. Caveats, as always, and I think, while we're looking at this, there are some caveats to consider. First is that this is assessment data. This is not the accountability data that we use to complete our school performance framework. The accountability files that we receive from the district include alternative assessments. These do not include that. So I do want to note that these numbers may change when we actually go to complete our school performance framework in its final form, because they are somewhat different indicators. But I think it's good to look at this point as somewhat of a preliminary preview as to where we are falling. The first thing that I'll note here is the Commission's average success rate. So just as a reminder, success rate is the percentage of students meeting or exceeding standard on the TCAP assessment. And so what you can see here, the highlight is that it's generally similar to or outperforming the resident districts. And so the Charter Commission is in blue, Memphis Charter County here is in orange, and MNPS is in gray. One thing I do want to note here too is the math scores we do not have available at this time. Math scores for high school are delayed. And so at this point we are only able to take a look at ELA scores.
But I think this is an important graphic. Like, our district is either similar to or outperforming our resident districts. That's huge.
And just on success rate.
And
not
just
even
on
looking
success
at
rate.
growth.
And so I think we're seeing good work. We still have work to do, but I just want to highlight this for this group is that this is, hearkening back to our earlier conversation, a reflection of the decisions that we've made.
What's the difference between English 1 and English 2?
happy to talk a little bit about that. English 1, so English 1 and 2 are both tested subjects for high school. English 1 is typically your 9th grade students, and English 2 is typically 10th. It doesn't always fall that way because with transfer situations and, some of that there is some fluidity. But I do want to note here, which is actually quite interesting, and I think maybe what we're getting at is English 2 here is actually only Bluff City.
Okay.
Because Camp Antioch Global High School was grade 9.
Okay.
Which I also want to call out, which is alluding to a future part of my presentation about Bluff City, but this is actually quite great to see. Any other questions on this slide? Great. In the same vein, wanted to talk about kind of the performance preview when we're looking at some sections that we're able to kind of identify at this point from the school performance framework. Mainly that is comparative performance. So as I noted, we do not have district data yet available to us, and we do not have accountability files available to us yet, so we have not run our framework. But we can look somewhat as a preview. We're seeing about 9 out of 12 schools on track to meet standard for the comparative performance piece of the school performance framework. So as a reminder, that's within the academic section. That's looking solely at the success rate of the school in comparison to the resident district and by subgroup. Want to note here that there are only 12 schools listed because Cornerstone Prep School has no tested data yet, and because they're not serving a grade level that's tested. We are still waiting on final letter grades, which are a large portion of our framework, similar to TVOS and mission-specific goals, and again, the final accountability data files. We'll provide you with a more detailed update in the October meeting, and final academic performance will be published within our annual report that is in January 1 of 2025. And with that, I will turn it to Rebecca for updates on third grade retention.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Ladebor. Don't worry, it did take me until 2nd grade to figure out how to spell it, so you're doing great. I'm going to take the next few slides to talk to you all about the 3rd and 4th grade promotion pathways. We're going to start with some terms and context. So I'm going to be using the terms performance level and proficiency rate. So I want to make sure we understand the distinction between those. On the TCAP, there are 4 performance levels: below expectations, approaching expectations, met expectations, and exceeded expectations. Those top 2 performance levels are the proficiency rate, also referred to as the success rate. We're going to be talking about both because both impact different pathways for students. We're also going to be talking about this idea of a cohort. A cohort of students are students that were in 3rd grade together and then in 4th grade together. You can think about that like your graduating class. You're in class with them in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. There may be a few fluctuations, but generally the same group of students. So back in 2021, there was a statute passed that focused on 3rd grade reading proficiency as measured by the TCAP as for students' pathways into 4th grade. This took effect during school year 22-23. And it defined pathways for students to 4th grade as promotion without additional supports. This would be for students that achieved proficiency on the TCAP or perhaps on a retake, or maybe they did summer programming and met certain requirements. There's also promotion by exemption. This would be, for example, a student with a documented disability that impacts reading. There was also promotion by appeal. These were appeals from families directly to the TDOE. And there's promotion with tutoring called the adequate growth pathway, where students have to attain an adequate growth target in 4th grade to move on to 5th grade. And we're going to talk more about that one in just a little bit. there's also retention. Now, there were some additional pathways that were approved by the General Assembly this past year, and that includes for students on that adequate growth pathway, some additional options if they do not achieve adequate growth in 4th grade, and then some additional pathways from 3rd to 4th grade based off of benchmark performance. So we're going to start looking at our first cohort of students that were held to this requirement. These are students that were in 3rd grade in school year 22-23, and then in 4th grade in school year 23-24. So this data is going to start to help us answer the question, are we seeing increases in proficiency rates as a result of these comprehensive supports for students? So I want to start by orienting you to what you're seeing on the slide. They're the same students represented in both bars. The bar on the left represents the 4 performance levels that we talked about earlier on the 3rd grade ELA TCAP for those students. The bar on the right represents those 4 performance levels for those students on the 4th grade ELA TCAP. And so this represents the students that were in the commission during 4th grade. I also did include 3rd grade scores for students that joined the commission as a result of a transfer in like Promise Academy Spring Hill. So 3rd grade proficiency was about 26%. It improved by 11 percentage points in 4th grade. That's good. We like that. More telling though is that red bar at the bottom. The percent of students in the below expectations performance level decreased by half from 3rd to 4th grade. We are going to be looking more closely at some of these pathways next, but I do want to pause here to see if there are any questions or comments. Right. So now we're going to talk about the adequate growth pathway. I'm sure this is a term that you have heard in the media, so I want to take a moment and build our understanding for what adequate growth actually is. Adequate growth answers the question, is the student more likely to be proficient now than they were before? It's very similar to TVOS. It looks at a student's growth trajectory and are we accelerating that growth? The methodology is very similar to standard accountability metrics based off of that individual student data. And so these students on the adequate growth pathway had that additional required tutoring, which I know a common question that we hear is, did that tutoring work? So I want to start with some overview information. For students in the 4th grade in a commissioned school for school year 23-24, about 27% of our students were on the adequate growth pathway. So for these students, if they met their adequate growth target, moving on to 5th grade. If they did not meet their adequate growth target, then they are going to have a conference with their stakeholders, and it's going to be determined, does this student move on to 5th grade with continued additional supports, or are they retained in 4th grade? So for those students, which was about 120 students in the commission, 60% of them met their adequate growth target, so on to 5th grade. 40% of them did not. So they are currently having those conferences this month to determine which pathway is going to be best for that student. Which leads us to the question, did the tutoring work? So to answer that, we are going to look at the comparison of students who received tutoring and students who did not. So I want to start by orienting you to this slide. You see 2 clusters of bars. The bars on the left represent students who did not receive additional tutoring officially. I say officially because I know our schools, I know the work that they do, and so no child is not receiving additional supports. But for students that were not officially on that tutoring pathway. Then on the right, we have students that were on the adequate growth pathway and were receiving that additional tutoring. Now within each of those, we've got an orange bar and a blue bar. The blue bar indicates the growth in performance level. So did a student go from below to approaching, or approaching to met, or met to exceeded, and then if they were exceeded and they stayed exceeded, I kept them there because that seemed fair. And then we also had this orange bar. And what was really neat is the TDOE provided us the adequate growth target and attainment for every fourth grader, regardless of if they were on the actual adequate growth pathway. So we have that for everybody. And so we can see students on the left not receiving that tutoring, students on the right receiving that tutoring. And so I would say that the answer here is based off of our available growth measures, students who received tutoring are demonstrating more growth than students that did not. So we are currently working with our schools to finalize pathways for our students that were in third grade to fourth grade for school year 23-24. Once we have buttoned up all of that with our schools, we will share out with our commissioners where everything fell. And with that, I will pass it back to Dr. Lund unless there are any questions.
So going back to the students on the adequate growth pathway
Yes.
and not meet their target,
Correct.
40%, what do these conferences entail? How is that determination made, right? If they went to school where I went to school, there's probably some level of inertia that would encourage them just to be pushed along, right? How does that work?
It's a great question. So we're talking about 50 students total.
Okay.
Those students, you'll have to forgive me for the number of guides that I've read on this. They are going to have a conference with parents, ELA teacher, principal, any interventionists, look at the whole of that student's portfolio and determine what is best for that student. So it's bringing in all the stakeholders for that individual student. So lots of conferences happening across the state right now, I'm sure. And then if they do end up moving on, actually for either of them, but if they do end up moving on, there's going to be an instructional plan that's put in place so that that student is receiving additional supports. And then if the student is retained, as with any child that is retained, there's going to have to be an academic plan put in place for that student as well.
Are the additional supports planned for those who move on into fifth grade? Let's say that at the end of this conference, the decision is made to move them into fifth grade, but they still failed to meet their adequate growth target. What's the fifth grade plan?
That's a great question. So all students are going to be receiving their Tier 1 instruction. That's your normal ELA class. And then they'll also be in some level of RTI, depending on what that student needs. But if a child is on, I believe they're calling it the conference committee pathway, something along those lines. If a child is on that pathway, they are also going to be receiving this additional tutoring like they did in fourth grade. And so we see it somewhat referred to as the Tennessee All-Core tutoring. That's just dependent on where the funding is coming from. But it is tutoring outside of those additional supports that all students are already getting.
So we're not just saying, okay, you're moving up, you've still got to get additional help.
Correct.
Okay.
This is as much a comment as it is a question. This is strong early evidence that the policy framework has influenced improved outcomes for students. Agree, disagree? Thank you.
I really like this slide.
It's a very powerful slide, and just knowing the important adult noise around this conversation, I'm wondering, has this slide been shown to policymakers who are inevitably trying to sort through the information they're receiving in the field?
Not yet. We're debuting it for the first time, but Hayden and I have already been talking about how are we distilling this information into usable information for policymakers, etc. I also think it is important to note that I think the impacts are not just the additional tutoring. I think the impacts are the foundational literacy plans that our charter schools are, all schools are having to put together, the, the focus on really foundations of reading out that are not, the queuing system, et cetera. The change to instructional materials, high quality instructional, I think all of that is leading to what we're seeing in these initial outcomes.
Do the statewide numbers look like this? I mean, these are our students.
Do we have statewide numbers, Rebecca? Great question.
Why, yes, we do.
Okay.
You can't see that.
I don't have them in pretty colors. But because what was really cool about breaking down this data set is that this is like unique student to unique student. So we're seeing that. So we don't have access to that at state level, but there was increase in proficiency at state level and in MMPS and in the Shelby County schools. And then I also looked at the decrease in that below expectations category. So just raw numbers, not apples to apples, but still interesting. And there was a sharp decrease across the state level, MMPS and Memphis Shelby County schools. I will note that ours was still
Way better. Okay.
All right, I will briefly talk to you all about the Bluff City Plan of Correction. So as a reminder, Bluff City is on probationary status for the last year, so school year 23-24. In the fall of last year, we worked closely with the school to revise their plan of correction in alignment with their performance from the previous school year. And this was brought to the commission for approval last October's commission meeting. Since this plan was put in place, we've worked really closely with the operator on to get updates as to where they are in terms of this plan and all the indicators within. These metrics, while the operator owns these metrics, the majority of them are internal metrics. We do work closely with them to get updates on these. And we review progress with them bi-monthly. So we meet with all their stakeholders every other month and very in detail go through their plan of correction with them. We reviewed their progress most recently on July 15th at their end of year closeout meeting in terms of the indicators within this plan and have a few updates to share for you all. So within the plan of correction, there are improvement objectives that are agreed upon between the commission and the school. But I do want to note that it is the burden of the school to create the plan of correction and the sub-indicators that are in alignment with these improvement objectives and ultimately track and report out the data that they have. So we will have indicators that are aligned to state testing and to TVOS, et cetera. So for those, we are still waiting on updates, obviously, as the, data is presented later in the school year. But I think for now, we have some things that we can look at that are internal indicators to kind of give us an idea of where they're performing. So the first thing that I want to note here is the first improvement objective is to increase academic achievement for ELA and math annually. There are again multiple sub-indicators within this. The school is meeting 4 out of the 7 sub-indicators when they look at internal assessments for academic proficiency. Ultimately, the highlight here is that there are some really good gains that we've seen at Bluff City for ELA proficiency. They've increased their estimated proficiency to about 5%, increased by about 5%, which is good year over year. Math, as I mentioned earlier, we are still waiting on, state data for that. That is delayed, but we'll update you once we have that. The next item is looking at growth. We are waiting for TVOS, which is the ultimate indicator for this improvement objective, but something that I think is important to share is they really have worked to successfully revamp and implement their RTI system within the school, and we've seen some preliminary gains there where we're seeing students move tiers from levels 2 and 3, which is what we want to see, right? Tier 3 is your kind of lowest level significant support situation, and we're seeing those tiers decrease over time at Bluff, which is good. The last one on this slide is looking at post-secondary indicators. Those have to do with ACT, Ready Graduate, graduation rate, etc., and we are still waiting on those, but we'll update you once we have them. Other improvement objectives that are a part of their plan of correction have to do with chronic absenteeism. So they have decreased their chronic absenteeism rate year over year by roughly 10 percentage points. So they're looking at about 56% in terms of chronic absenteeism rate. While this is a very good decrease and we commend them, we acknowledge that 56% chronically absent is still quite high. So we'll continue to work with that operator to make sure that that number continues to decrease, but they are on track to meet their goal within this improvement objective.
Do they have attendance agreements between the parents and the school, the way they were described here with the?
I mean, I think it's structured a little differently, but yes, they have an attendance support team that works really closely with school administration to make sure that there are students are being tracked in terms of how many times they are absent, parents are brought in. They have a robust plan in place to work to combat it.
I think it'd be interesting to see, like what we heard today, those intervention steps they have. You know, like we heard there were 5, there's 8, there's, you know, all this, just to sort of get a sense of what is the, you know, what type of an approach do they have in place? Because you're right, Maggie, the 56%, while we're trying to get it down, is still a huge number. I mean, more than half these kids aren't in class, and so if y'all have time, we'd be interested to see what that whole program looks like.
Absolutely, and I think for our update for you in October, we can definitely have some more information on that. And with that, I do want to note too that this rate is preliminary. It is an estimate. We will give you the final chronic absenteeism numbers in October. The next piece here is enrollment. They have improved their enrollment. They met their enrollment goal of an ADM of 476 students. They have, last year's ADM was 478. So that was met as well as an indicator. The last indicator that is on here for an improvement objective is their suspension rate. They are off track. They did not meet their goal in terms of suspensions. So they had 4 additional suspensions outside of their goal, which was unique suspensions to be 70. And they did end last year with 74. Or I'm sorry, under 35 unique suspensions. But we, again, are working very closely with the operator in terms of what that will look like for next year and conversations around that goal. Question.
Yeah, this is a dumb question. I have obviously no background in the classroom. But suspensions are obviously important, but how much of that is within their control, right?
Thank you for asking
Like
that.
knowing my kids, right? They're part of the problem.
I can't speak for that, but I think that's a really good question, and thank you for bringing it up. It is a struggle. I think the operator, and when we engage them in conversations around the school, one of the first things that they say is a lot of it is outside of their control. I think a big piece too that the operator brought to us is thinking about culture setting and some of the really, I think, intentional work that they've done over the last 2 years to make sure that their culture is really sound and really strong. When you set an expectation in the beginning, there's part of that is following through, and I think some of that is what we're seeing here, where they're trying to set some expectations, and that's what the operator has shared with us. I think also, one thing to note here too is we have excluded zero tolerance suspensions from this too. That is something that you'll hear a lot about as well, where they have zero tolerance suspensions are outside of the operator and the school administration's control. So I do want to note within this data that has been removed, but.
Do unique suspensions include in school suspension?
Yes.
Okay. So all these suspensions are not all out
Out
of
of
school?
no.
Some of these kids are.
Yes, they're in school, yeah. So once accountability data is released, we will fully evaluate their plan of correction and bring it to you all with an update in October. Also, some things to note that outside of just the simple plan of correction, which I say simple, it is not simple. It is very involved, very intricate. But I think some things that also we are going to be heavily considering. Obviously, we're waiting on math proficiency data. That is going to be a big factor here. School letter grade, TVOS performance, and then finally the priority school list. Those are being run. It's important for us to see where they fall with that. Last year they were identified as a custom school, so we will want to see how that shakes out. But we will, as I mentioned, bring a full recommendation to you all at the October 2024 meeting in regards to their performance in alignment with the plan of correction. Any questions? Oh, one more thing that I will bring up. Bluff City is under a network transition. We have been working really closely with the operator as they transition from Green Dot Tennessee to Iota Public Schools. This was effective on July 1. We meet with them weekly. Obviously, there are quite a bit of operational things that need to switch over. Lots of very intricate, tiny, small things that we are working with them on very closely to make sure that they have a smooth transition, but wanted to provide an update that they are on track to complete their checklist that we've provided them for a very strong start for next school year. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Good.
No, that's good.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maggie and Rebecca. And I just want to state before we move to the next section, I think as evidenced by the questions from commissioners, as the committee chair, I certainly remain concerned about Bluff City. I know that the staff is staying very close to the school and working with them closely, but I just wanted to assure the commissioners that as the chair, it is something that's certainly top of mind for me, and I know that I've been having conversations with the staff regularly, and hopefully we can remedy the situation, or if not, obviously take the appropriate action to ensure that these students are being served appropriately. The next item on our agenda is the preview of the school year 24-25 from Director of Authorizing Beth Figueroa and then Authorizing Coordinator Trent Carlson. Beth and Trent, you're recognized.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Patterson. As you mentioned, we are going to provide an overview of the 24-25 school year. We just closed out 23-24, but we thought it would be important just to ground ourselves as our schools get ready to get back in session, what we look like as an overall portfolio, because we know that each and every year we are continuing to grow and add schools. And so this first slide here is to talk about the schools that we will be opening and adding to our portfolio in the next few years. And so we have 2 schools that will be opening through our New Start process in 24-25. That is KIPP Antioch Global Middle School, as well as Rutherford Collegiate Prep. And then we have 2 schools that are pre-existing schools that are coming to us and transitioning to the commission. That's Cornerstone Prep Leicester Campus, as well as Rocket Ship Nashville Northeast Elementary. One of the schools came through our New Start process, the other one through a renewal appeal. So there's all those different pathways that the schools can take in order to join our portfolio. And then we have 4 schools that are slated to open in school year 25-26. And all of these schools came to us through the New Start appeal process. So the next is we look at our portfolio, really breaking it down by geographic region. First looking at our schools that are within the geographic district of Memphis-Shelby County Schools. We have 8 schools at this point in our portfolio that are in that geographic region, 7 of which will be open in 24-25, and 1 will be going through the pre-opening process, which we're going to be talking about in today's presentation. That school is Empowered. They're going to be opening in 25-26. And something that's great about our Memphis-Shelby County region is that we have all grades K through 12 recognized. Next, looking at geographic district MMPS, here we have 11 schools, many of which are in the Antioch region, which I know Maggie talked about earlier, but we will have 9 schools that will be open and operating in 24-25, and 2 schools that are going to be going through the pre-opening process. And similarly, we have all grade levels recognized, and so this is another growing area within our portfolio. And then just looking at our other geographic district areas, in Rutherford County, we have Rutherford Collegiate Prep, which will be opening starting the 24-25 school year. A lot of really exciting things going on down in that area. Their building is well underway. And then Jackson-Madison County Schools, we have American Classical Academy Jackson-Madison that is still going through the pre-opening process with us, and they are planning to open in the 25-26 school year. And so when we look at our overall portfolio for 24-25, we will have 17 schools open and operating. However, we will have a total of 21 schools that we will be managing from a portfolio perspective. And so with this growth is really exciting, and in the next slides, Trent's going to start talking about our pre-opening process, and they really go hand in hand because the way that we get schools in our portfolio and the foundation and bedrock of bringing in schools to open successfully is our pre-opening process. And so I will not steal Trent's thunder because he has a lot of great things to talk about with pre-opening, but this is just an important discussion that we've been having, not just as a commission, but I would say even nationally. We see trends with it's hard to open a charter school. And so all that to say, our portfolio is growing, it's exciting, and really pre-opening is really the foundation to having a strong portfolio. And so I'm going to pass things over to Trent for pre-opening.
Thank you, Beth. I'm excited to share with some our updates that we've done to our pre-opening checklist as we, as Beth said, look forward to more and more schools joining our portfolio and the schools that are currently in the pre-opening process. I also think it's relevant and timely. I was listening to the stakeholders here earlier this afternoon talking about going through pre-opening, and that is the work that we are talking about right now too. So on an annual basis, commission staff completes updates to the pre-opening checklist. When we do these reviews, there are instances where we determine that there are items that are no longer necessary to include on the checklist. Maybe they're no longer applicable or they're better suited in a reporting calendar. So there are times where we take items off. Also, at times there's new legislation that's passed or something that needs to get added into the checklist. So we use the annual refresh to do that as well. And so we did that this year and took a look at each of our items with various team members. But this year we also took the opportunity to just make a change in the organization of the checklist, hopefully to make it more user-friendly, but also to emphasize specific components of the checklist. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll talk through these sections during the presentation, but just big picture, our pre-opening checklist is now going to be reorganized into two sections. The first that we're calling Ready to Open Criteria, and then the typical compliance items listed below in a compliance checklist. The rationale behind this move was a combination of things. First, best practices from the National Association for Charter School Authorizers, NACSA, but then also operator and commissioner feedback. So I'm going to talk about the process that we took on the next slide, but do want to just state we're not adding in items when I'm talking about this. We're truly reorganizing items that were already included within our checklist and trying to emphasize the importance of these ready to open criteria. So we've determined ready to open criteria are items that are related to facilities, enrollment, staffing, and financing. These four things are the main topics that we've always focused on in our monthly pre-opening meetings with schools. We ask them for their updates on these topics regularly, but we felt that we could better call them out in the checklist as well. So what we've done is just take the items that were already in the checklist related to those topics and shift them to the top. And we hope, again, that that's going to emphasize their significance and they won't be lost in a list of compliance items, and they'll always be at the forefront of these are what you need to be ready to open. We're also going to include in that ready to open criteria a submission of an updated startup plan. I think that was a suggestion from Chair Richards, so thank you. But this will give operators a chance to provide updates, updated timeline from their startup plan that they had already included in the charter application. We know that by the time they get to the beginning of pre-opening, sometimes those applications are months, if not maybe even a year, out of date. So we just think that that updated startup plan to then make the basis of the pre-opening will be very helpful. And most schools have already done that on their own anyways, so we've just included it in our checklist. But briefly, just to talk about the process, while drafting this new updated, reorganized checklist, as I mentioned, commission staff engaged a variety of stakeholders and external partners. First, the authorizing team attended NACSA's training sessions regarding pre-opening. They actually just recently released a ready-to-open playbook outlining best practices. As Beth said, it is a very relevant topic for everybody across the nation. So we went to some of their trainings. I will say that we were excited to see that several of the strategies and practices that we've already used, like differentiated checklists based on operator, having monthly meetings, giving a compliance item list ahead of time, like these were things that NACSA was calling out as best practices, so we were glad to see that. But we also saw that there was an opportunity for us to improve upon our process and our checklist, really by trying to emphasize those like ready to open criteria. We also got commissioner feedback. I mentioned Chair Richards, that idea for the updated startup plan, thank you. Also thank you Commissioner Lauren Smith, we were able to meet with, asked great questions, gave us feedback as we were drafting this, which was very helpful. And then lastly, we met with several of our operators who have recently gone through the pre-opening process and just gathered their input on these proposed edits. I do just want to say one of the meetings was with Tennessee Nature Academy. It was very helpful, and I share just kind of as like a reminder to us all, Tennessee Nature Academy is our only school that is opened without either exercising the right to delay a year or intentionally planning in an extra year as part of the pre-opening. So I found it very helpful to talk specifically with them, knowing that they did open on time, but like what was helpful and what could have been even more helpful. So as I've stated, the main edits that we're proposing is just a reorganization of items. With that being said, as part of NACSA's best practices, they do recommend setting forth specific targets for schools. So as we shifted those ready to open criteria, those things related to facilities, enrollment, staffing, and financing to the top, we wanted to include targets for our schools to aim, some of them that you can see on the slide before you. I do think it's very important to note, and we put this in our checklist too, we are not including these targets as like drop dead. If you don't have them, you have to delay, but they're really intended to be realistic goals to share with operators and guide their decision making as they go through pre-opening. So I mentioned I have a few on the slide before you. As far as our suggested facility timeline and a target that we're just including, we've drafted that by December 1st of their pre-opening year. So we're, thinking 7-8 months at least before the school will open. Schools should have identified a suitable facility aligned to their charter application and the necessary financing for that facility. Just quickly, as commissioners and commission staff are well aware, this is by far the most difficult item for all of our schools that are going through pre-opening. And with that being said, like we've seen how difficult it is to secure a facility, especially in like the spring months, but as the school year is coming fast, which is why we wanted to suggest a target for identifying this facility being well into this process on December 1st. And then secondly on this slide, we've listed, draft student enrollment targets. So this is something that comes directly from NACSA's best practices, what they suggested. We have shifted the percentages slightly from like NACSA's percentages, and that was like purely based on operator feedback. And then you'll also see that in May, we moved from expecting a certain percentage of student applications to a certain percentage of completed enrollments, which we believe is obviously an important distinction to make during the spring of a pre-opening year. So at this point, wanted to stop and hear from commissioners your thoughts, any questions on this process in general, or especially the specific ready to open criteria, and enrollment targets that we have drafted to include.
So in the enrollment area, is it worth putting something in there where not only do we have the percentage target, but that we also know where those students are coming from? So that we avoid, or we got early warning if there are some exceptions happening that are students that are sort of outside of what the law allows you to draw from, so that we know enough ahead of time. We can work with them. We can try to put in any kind of a plan that adjusts that, but that, so we know that sooner, rather than waiting till about a month before somebody's getting ready to open, and then all of a sudden we get hit with this. I think that to me, if I saw it up there, so that not only we're looking at the target number, but where are you drawing students from? So then we know if we potentially have an issue that we've got to work with them on.
Yeah, thank you. And I will just say too, as part of the submissions, we've already asked for like estimates on certain subgroups of students that are enrolling, but that just makes me think of another way that we can ask for where the students are coming from. So thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you. And with that, I think I'm passing it back to Beth.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Trent. I have just a few items to wrap up as we look forward to the next school year. As a reminder, we already had a comprehensive presentation on this at a prior commission meeting, but just as a reminder, we do have 3 schools that are going through the renewal process. And so this is a year-long process, and so we have Lee, Neely's Bend, Libertas School of Memphis, and Cornerstone Prep Denver going through the renewal process. There is a review committee. They have already reviewed the application. They've conducted the capacity review, much of which was focused on operations and finance. They will have a site visit in September, and that will really dive in much more deep into the academics. They'll speak with the governing board, etc. But there is a review committee report that is being drafted to summarize the initial concerns, as well as strengths that have been identified through the review committee process. And then both the review committee report as well as the site visit report are going to be included in the executive director's recommendation as an exhibit. The commission will be holding public hearings on all of these renewals in November. And then in January 25, the commission will make a decision on the renewal for those 3 schools. Oh, my slide did not go forward. There we go. And just as a reminder, a renewal is a 10-year term at this point. I know that you were having that discussion just earlier today, but as a reminder, it is for a full 10-year term, and renewals can also not be conditional. So some things to keep in mind as we go through the renewal process. And then lastly, to talk about, Maggie previously talked about the intervention that we are doing with Bluff City High School, but part of authorizing is we have the fun tasks that we do, which is opening schools and site visits, but a part of our responsibility also includes using intervention policies when they are needed and when they're warranted. And so the commission, we do have our intervention policy that outlines the steps that we take as staff when we see that a school may need some more just stronger safeguards, stronger hand-holding, and working together to work through some issues that may be identified. And so at this time, we have issued a notice of concern to Promise Academy Spring Hill. It is a level 1 intervention, and so while Bluff City is more of a level 3, that's where they're on probationary status as well as the plan of correction. So this is our lowest level of intervention, but we did want to just highlight here that there were some items that were triggered due to some performance deficiencies, mostly surrounding, we still do not have their school year 23 audit, so we are more than 6 months behind in receiving their audit. We've had some challenges with financial reporting as far as getting items submitted, accuracy, and then there have also been some concerns flagged with their special populations. And so we have provided the notice of concern to the school as well as to their governing board, and then staff will be out at the school site next week to meet with them so we can start talking through next steps, making sure that it's really clear what is needed, so that way we can work together and see them move off of that level 1 status. And so with that, that concludes the 24-25 school year overview, but if there's any questions, happy to take them.
Will be questions from commissioners? Okay, thank you for that report, and I think in a similar fashion, we're also staying very close to the Promise Academy situation. To the extent you need
Not as
support.
close as they're gonna be next week.
I was gonna allude to that.
Yes, Chair Richards will be meeting with them as well.
Commissioners will be in attendance.
What I don't want is to get to the end of this and they say, you guys didn't warn us.
That's right.
You didn't give us notice of the fact there were,
Yes.
so we're gonna have a little get together.
Okay, thank you, Beth and Trent. The final item on our agenda is a presentation on the school year 24-25 Special Populations Plan from the Director of School Programs and Supports, Nate Parker, and Exceptional Education Coordinator, Katie Bridges. Nate and Katie, you're recognized.
Great, thank you, Chair Patterson. I want to recognize, I know you just had a long day of presentations, and so we appreciate the opportunity just to share out on special populations and our programs and what we're looking forward to for next year. So I'm going to start us off, Katie's going to start us off with a special populations overview, kind of defining what that means and where our programs are sitting in the number of students across our schools. Then we're going to tag team the monitoring and reporting requirements and how that's changed over the past couple of years. And then I'll round us out here with areas of strength and growth opportunities, as well as looking ahead to this upcoming school year. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Katie.
So to get started today, we just wanted to define what we were talking about when we mean special populations in our discussion. So we'll be referring to students with disabilities, so students with IEPs, as well as English learners, and then students with a 504 plan. The commission also monitors other types of special populations, including students receiving RTI support, students with characteristics of dyslexia, students experiencing homelessness, and then students who are migrant or in foster care.
And Katie, just for our listening audience, could you just briefly describe what the 405 plan is?
Sure. 504 plans are for students who may have a diagnosed disability or may be suspected of having a disability. So it's like essentially an accommodations plan.
Thank you.
Sure.
And so when you talk about foster care, does that mean we've got some relationship with DCS, other state agencies like that who handle foster care and things of that nature? Is that?
It's usually more of a direct relationship with the school, but there have been instances where we have communicated with them also.
Okay.
So here is our overview of our students with disabilities population count. So we're comparing our data with MNPS, Memphis Shelby County Schools, and then state and national data. As you can see, we have 610 students with disabilities. And I want to note that these numbers may be slightly different from the authorizing team's presentation. We pulled our data from the very end of this school year, and they pulled their data from our October 1st data pull date, which is what is used for state reporting. You can see the range of the percent of total student enrollment is between 11 and 15%, and we are right at the midpoint with 13% of students with disabilities. And we wanted to note that this count should not be influenced by regional norms, but it's really more determined by the processes that schools have for child find and identifying students within their schools. As you can see on this chart, this is our percentage of students with disabilities broken down by individual school. So the red bar in the middle is the commission average. The green bars are students in the Memphis area, or schools in the Memphis area. And then our blue bars are students in the Nashville area. As you can see, the range of students with disabilities is from 8 to 32, which is a lot greater variance from kind of our state and national data. A couple factors that may be impacting that, as Maggie said earlier, the size of the school does play a role in that. As you can see, Cornerstone Prep School, which is our small school, does have one of the highest percentages of students with disabilities. It's also important to note that 4 out of 5 of the schools on the right-hand side are schools that were originally zone schools in the Achievement School District that transitioned to the commission.
And then we also do have some schools that have great special education programs, and there's a lot of great word of mouth in their communities, which causes them to attract more students with disabilities. The commission does review this data as part of our school performance framework, and we do have discussions with schools when their populations are outside a reasonable range, just to ensure their school policies and procedures are properly being connected to identify students with disabilities. And then this chart breaks down student disabilities just by category. Students may qualify for more than one disability, so this does not add up to the 610, as some students do have more than one disability category. Overall, this is what we would expect to see in terms of data. So specific learning disability, which encompasses disabilities in reading or writing or math or written expression, tends to be the most common disability that is identified. And then we also have quite a few students with language impairments or speech impairments, and that is very common, especially in elementary school. One area of concern would be our count of students who identify as intellectually gifted. TDOE has noted that many districts are under-identifying students in this area, so we are looking for more ways to provide support to schools this year to hopefully help them improve that. Any questions about our special education data?
Only question I've got really around some of that, when I look at it, you know, what are our schools able to provide? Because I'm sure a lot of those kids also have probably some mental health issues, especially around some of those disabilities and things. What are our schools able to provide to help those students that they're doing that might be a little bit different than some of the other more traditional schools?
So when schools are providing any required services through an IEP, they would either use the staff that they have hired, or they a lot of times rely on contracted services. So it would be dependent on the school and the determinations made by their IEP team to determine if they would require psychological counseling services or additional services that might be outside of academic supports. But that would be up to the school and their team to determine what types of supports they might provide for mental health services.
So transitioning to English learners, just some more terms. What we mean by active English learners are students who have a non-English language background that have qualified for direct or indirect English language services via an individualized learning plan. We also have transitional students. So we are required to monitor students for 4 years after they have exited from direct services. There are students that will continue to have an ILP plan for those first 2 years, and then after that, the third and fourth transitional year, just kind of more of a monitoring process. So, in context, you can see that these indicators are from various school years and basing it on the most recent data that was available. But as you can see, in our last school year, our EL population count was small but mighty. But we do have a significant percentage of total student enrollment. So 26% of the students in the commission identify as English learners. This is one of the highest percentages in the state. This data is much more dependent on region and local trends, unlike our students with disabilities data. It's important to note that Metro Nashville Public Schools has the highest EL population in the state. They have 1/3 of the total EL students in the entire state. And they are seeing over 1,000 new EL students each year. We do have over 50 languages represented by students that attend commission schools, but we are continuing to see this as a growing population. This is the breakdown of our EL population by school. The blue bar represents students who are active English learners and receiving direct services. And then the orange bar represents the total students who are active and also transitional students. As you can see, our Nashville schools have much higher rates of English language learners than in Memphis. But specifically, even within Nashville, many of our commission schools are located, like the authorizing team said, in the Antioch
area, which does have one of the highest concentrations of families of English learners. And then it is important to note too that Memphis is also seeing some growth. For instance, Cornerstone Prep School, their EL population is expected to double this year. So even schools in Memphis are also seeing an increase in students.
Great. Thank you, Katie. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the monitoring and reporting requirements that are connected to, sorry about that, serving students in these special population groups. So as the district, we are responsible for ensuring that all state and federal laws are in compliance with our schools, specifically serving our students with disabilities and English learners. And one thing that we just wanted to highlight was the change in requirements and the change in how the program operates across the state more recently. So ILPs, the individualized learning plans that serve English learners, have been in place in Tennessee for a while. However, in school year 2018-2019, that was the first school year that it was required that districts put them into place and provide them for all English learners. Since then, we've seen other pretty significant changes. So last year we had the change in the online portal that we use to store and monitor all documentation that support special populations. That's TN Pulse. So that's an online portal that you can, you have your IEPs serving students with disabilities, ILPs serving students who are English learners, ILPDs, that's for students with characteristics of dyslexia, and then the 504 plans we talked about earlier as well. And so while that's a great tool that we now have, obviously when you change to a new system, there's going to be hiccups, and it was a trickier rollout last fall that Katie managed beautifully. And so that was something new that happened last year. Additionally, what happened last year was changes in how the ratio for ESL teachers to EL students was calculated. This was probably one of the most significant hurdles for us to overcome this past year, because before that we were able to use head counts of teachers, and that changed to their FTE. So schools, especially in our Antioch region, who were in compliance up until this fall, very quickly became out of compliance. So that was something that we worked with the department through our results-based monitoring process to make sure we had a plan to come into compliance for this fall. Again, huge shout out to Katie, who worked with each school to come up with a plan to do that. We feel good about being in compliance here in this fall across each of our schools. Additionally, ILPDs, that's again for students with characteristics of dyslexia. That was new this past year as well. And so there will be, I think that also is something that I think got lost in some of the other transitions last year with TN Pulse and TISA funding. So I anticipate that being another area that we focus a lot on this year, upcoming school year as well. TISA funding is obviously had an impact as well, because there were different funding methodologies used for students in these subgroups. And so that also was a shift that we saw in how people began to view special populations and the data, and how they connected that data to completed documentation in TN Pulse.
Is the TISA funding still a year behind?
Yes.
So they do the TISA funding based on last year's population?
Correct.
So for these schools that are seeing a rapid increase in English learners, they have to bear the cost of this without any increased funding?
Yes.
That might be something we could ask.
That was getting ready to be my question is,
Yeah.
what are we seeing? Forget just our commission. I mean, think about it statewide.
Right.
Because all public schools are all public schools. What are we seeing pressures on school districts around? I mean, if you're talking about one school with 50 languages, I mean, it's kind of a little bit mind-blowing, that you've got to have somebody that's a lot of resources, because you don't have one person that can just teach 50 languages to kids. So, what are we seeing as far as pressures on school systems for being able to keep up with this rapid rise of EL populations?
Absolutely. And so some that we talk about at the bottom here, but schools have had to hire more staff. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges we saw last year, specifically with that ratio requirement. There were some schools that had they were below by like 6 full teachers that they would have to hire. And that's, there's a lot of implications of that, because it's not just the hiring teachers, but also the allocating funding. And then also there's every district's in the same position where they're all recruiting teachers. And so it's hard to recruit teachers who have the required endorsement in English, ESL, and in special education. So there's a smaller pool to pull from. And I know that we discussed earlier, this is a particular area of strain on rural schools as well, in particular where there's just fewer access to fewer resources, and recruiting teachers is something that they are also feeling the pressure of. I think that's probably the biggest strain right now is hiring, and we had schools that had to change their schedules to accommodate the 60-minute requirement. So in elementary school, you have to provide 60 minutes of field instruction by an ESL endorsed teacher. So one of our schools actually had to adjust their schedule after the year started to make sure that they were able to meet those requirements. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I just want to make sure and we heard about it today on the panel, and this is just how school funding works. School funding is based on a lagging year. And so for TISA, our schools with student enrollment in the 23-24 school year, they're getting funded for the 24-25 school year based on the student weights for 23-24. So I think Commissioner Eddie Smith, to your point, if you have a student who is newly enrolled in the 24-25 school year with a high, a low incidence disability, has a lot of needs, your funding for that is not, as a school, is not generating until the next school year. And that's just how school funding in Tennessee works. And so that is a challenge. If you have new students, you have new needs, is how to balance all of this with the existing funding.
Have we approached the TDOE about finding ways of using some unallocated lottery funds as grants to be able to help schools with, across the state, relieve the burden? Because, if you're talking about the kind of increases that you all were talking about, just for us, but Metro Nashville, what's happening in Shelby County, they're taking money, in order to do that, means they're taking money out of another pot. Could we find another pot of money that they could apply to offset that till they get their TISA funding caught up? That's something that I think ought to be a bigger discussion up to the TDOE. That could we use some of those lottery funds that are unallocated each year for?
Yeah, they could do it halfway through the year and then say, we'll true it up next year once we know what your numbers were. But to me, this seems just like a very unreasonable burden, and very uneven burden, because some schools are hit with it extraordinarily hard, the Antioch schools, for instance. And it's not just our schools in Antioch, it's Davidson County schools in Antioch as well. And it seems to me maybe it's an ask for the legislature across the board on behalf of all schools. Because the number of people who are being injected into these communities across the state with no funding is astronomical.
I would also highlight one additional to comment on that, is that in a traditional public school district where hiring can be done at the district level, a district like MPS also has the ability to offset some of this, because they can distribute employees and staff across schools in a way that we aren't able to, because we don't employ people at the district level. In fact, when we first realized we were out of compliance with the 1-35 ratio, the department recommended that we, as a district, hire more teachers and staff, and we said that's not an option for us. So I also think again, if there's also disparities. If you are a one-off charter school versus a network, it would be an additional challenge if you also don't have a larger scale to potentially work some of that as well.
Yeah.
And the last change that's happening this year is that there are new standards and assessments for English learners as well. So that's going to be a particular focus of our new English learner programs coordinators to onboard our schools onto those new resources.
Sorry, Nate. As you mentioned that, just one of the things, and again, I don't know what's possible, and Tess may pull up and throw something at me here in a second. But as we look at where our schools are clustered, is there a possibility that we as an LEA, to the point that MNPS can do this, that we could almost create, if there was a funding mechanism, almost an MOU within the charter network where they could share resources across the sector, where it's not any one entity. Maybe it is an MOU where they're funding it through us, but they're all equally sharing so that they're not having to bear the full burden.
Yes, and we've started to have some of those preliminary, we've thrown that idea out there for
Okay.
operators to percolate on, of like, is there a way for us for everybody to think about, particularly for our schools in the Antioch area, but it could be translate to wherever, is do we start thinking about these economies of scale as it relates to both EL and special education.
Okay.
So as we noted, the impact of all these changes requires additional school and district staff, new trainings and new resources that sometimes come from the state and sometimes that we're creating for our schools or schools are creating themselves. Revisions to our existing monitoring processes and our reporting requirements. And then also, I know that Melanie's going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but we've also revised the way that we allocate our funding, our federal dollars to mimic the way that TISA funds allocate additional funds to students with disabilities as well. So we have, I just want to also go over the monitoring that we conduct as a district. So the state is going to monitor us as a district. They do this through the results-based monitoring process. I know I talked about this extensively this past year. They do it every year, and that's the primary way that they're monitoring the federal programs requirements around students with disabilities and English learners. Additionally, we conduct they conduct annual desktop monitoring of the district once per year. So they will pull out IEPs from TM Pulse to review and provide us feedback. We also have to score them ourselves, and then they score them and they are checking to calibrate to see whether or not we are evaluating them in the same way that the state does. And while this isn't in effect yet, they have hinted that they will do the same process for ILPs, but that hasn't been rolled out yet. In addition, we provide monitoring of our schools. So we provide our own kind of RVM style monitoring through our subrecipient monitoring process. We also conduct our own desktop monitoring, and that includes all special ops documentation and TM Pulse. However, one change for this year is that we are adjusting that so that schools that have more risk in the risk assessment procedures that I will end our presentation with, they will receive more frequent desktop monitoring, whereas schools that are lower risk will receive less frequent monitoring. We also join the operations team on their annual site visits, and that's an opportunity for us to be able to observe our special ops classrooms, interview staff, and review documents in the buildings. As part of that risk assessment process I hinted at, if required, there could be an additional site visits focused just on special populations or English learners. And then finally, we have monthly population counseling providing and our data monitoring to ensure that there's accuracy across TM Pulse as well as our student information systems.
In terms of LEA reporting, we are required to complete mid-year and end-of-year special education reports that are really just a review of student data. We have IDEA funding reports, our SEER, and our maintenance and effort reports. And then we have to complete an annual TELSA report, which is a self-assessment of our EL program. Schools have to have quite a bit of reporting. They're required to hold meetings for all students who are new to their school with IEPs or 504s and ILPs within the first 30 days of school. They have to complete annual reviews of IEPs, ILPs, ILPDs, and 504 plans. And then students who have IEPs and 504s also require additional meetings to determine if they continue to be eligible. And finally, schools are also required to conduct quarterly RTI data reviews. In terms of the supports we provide, we must address all findings and areas of noncompliance that we discover through our TDOE level monitoring, our desktop monitoring, reports that have been provided by schools themselves, or parent or other complaints. Those supports may include an informal or formal investigation, We provide letters identifying areas of noncompliance, and we may also ask for corrective actions, which can include training or technical assistance, revising documentation, reviewing their policies and procedures, and any other deliverables.
So we wanted to just provide an overview of all the work that goes into monitoring our programs, but now we want to shift to focusing on where we see our greatest strengths and where we see some growth opportunities in reflection of this past school year. So we'll start with areas of success. Last year we were selected for level 3 results-based monitoring. I provided an update that in the spring, and we were able to complete all corrective action in June 2024, so that's officially closed, which is great. This was a particular area of success because this was the first year as a district going through level 3 monitoring. Additionally, we received consistent praise from the department over our processes and procedures and the competency of our school staff when they interviewed them. And we had very few and minor findings to correct. So that was a big win for us. Additionally, annually we receive what's called an IDEA determination from the department, and it's regarding our overall kind of performance on different objectives within serving students with disabilities. So our overall risk level decreased to the lowest level, so we are officially in meet, which is great. This just means that there's less intervention required from the department, so we're glad to see the positive trajectory there. Like I mentioned before, the Team Pulse transition was a bit rocky. The rollout across the state caused a lot of confusion and frustration among districts who were struggling to get connected. And then we also had several schools transitioning from the ASD, which just created an additional hurdle for our schools to get all their students uploaded in a timely manner. I cannot shout out Katie enough for her leadership. She had only been working at the commission for like a month. I was like, here you go, and she did it. And so she worked endlessly with her schools on the phone, answering emails, to ensure that they were able to access Team Pulse, answer questions, going to all the trainings, something she was learning how to do herself, and really gained a strong rapport and trust from our schools because of her work there. Similarly, with the conversation around connection to TISA funding, there was kind of a panic towards the end of the year regarding getting all of our ILPs and IEPs into the new Team Pulse. Katie provided plenty of reminders to schools in advance, but as the year ended and people were seeing the clock tick down, Katie provided went above and beyond to provide frequent updates on their percentage completion, helping schools identify which documents were missing or incomplete, so that we get our completion rates as close to 100% as possible. So again, just a phenomenal job from Katie this year. And then with that, our whole team was new this year. So myself, Claire, and Katie joined the commission a year ago. And so we, as we were doing this work, building out the team, being trained on all these systems, and getting to learn and work with the rest of the incredible commission team. So we just felt like in general, the team that we've built out has been a huge success this year as well. In terms of growth opportunities, so one area that we identified pretty quickly was that if I wanted to keep Katie, I needed to clone her or find a way to create additional someone else to share the work with. So that was something we identified really early on, and I just really appreciate everyone who helped our agency secure that additional FT for this year. So we took what was called the Special Populations Coordinator role and split that into two different positions. Additionally, some other growth opportunity within our English Learner program, we are transitioning to a new assessment and new standards. So we have, Katie has gone to all the trainings and really rolled out and provide all that communication to our schools to make sure that they know what's going on. And we're onboarding our new English Learner program coordinator as well, John, to help carry the torch there. But this is an opportunity where we can lean in and just make sure that our schools feel really supported, understand what the changes are, refer them to existing resources, and then create our own. Additionally, we saw an area of growth in our own monitoring, just the number and frequency of findings on the ILPs. So that's findings would be things that are small, missing checkboxes, to larger issues where there might be incomplete or inadequate ILP sections. And so one area that we decided we want to focus on is both providing training on how to develop quality ILPs, and then also for our school leaders how to monitor internally so that they don't have to wait for us to catch them later on. And then we want to focus on providing proactive supports based on the new risk assessment procedures that we rolled out. So taking the data that we're seeing to provide specific training where certain schools are struggling, or full district training where we see when looking at exceptional education or special education. Now that we have additional people on our team, Katie can really focus just on the special education side of things. And so in addition to IEPs, we have these other documents we've talked about, ILPDs, IL4 plans, and then our intervention process, that's RTI. So this is an area where now Katie will have more opportunity to focus on other areas we want to support our schools in developing quality supports to our students in these, who require these supports. She mentioned gifted programming earlier, and so we've already had conversations about opportunities to share best practices. We have a couple of schools we want to highlight and the work that they've done to serve students in this capacity, and so that's something we're going to roll out next year as well. And then similar to the first point, just using proactive data from our risk assessment to make sure that we're catering our supports and training the schools as needed. So I'll end us up here looking ahead to the next school year. So one main focus is on our school level supports that we're providing. And so one document that my team is probably sick of hearing me talk about at this point is our scope and sequence for next year. And that's just having a plan in advance of where we know supports are going to be needed, differentiated based on time of year and also school type and the experience of their school leader. So we've been drafting something that looks ahead to each quarter. Where do we know are going to be the areas our schools will need support, and then how those supports need to be adjusted based on whether a school is in their first year or their 10th year, and whether or not they have a seasoned coordinator or someone who's brand new. And something else that Katie piloted was creating a kind of a library of resources where everything that we do create is codified in one place that our schools can access on demand. She also taught me how to record videos so that you can update individual slides and not have to record a whole video again. So appreciate again for that. That will just make our work that much easier to keep things up to date from year to year and continue to grow the resources we create for our schools. And I'll note there too that, as a district, and I know this comment was made earlier, we respect our schools' autonomy. So we create resources knowing that we can't force them to use them a lot of times if it's not required, but we still want them to be available, and we want to gain feedback from our schools and input from our schools to see what would be helpful for them as well. And so we use that to determine what supports we want to create. As far as our team structure for next year, John Bouyer is our new English learner program coordinator. He comes to us from a commissioned school, has a lot of experience serving special populations, and he's in week 2 and already getting ready to lead his first presentation next week. Not here this week, but you're going to meet him in October for the next commission meeting. And then so we reorganized Katie's position. She's focusing solely on exceptional education. And so now that we have 2 people on that team, we're really excited about being able to provide more supports. And then the last thing we're looking forward to next year is our risk assessment, which I talked about before. So our risk assessment, it takes prior year data, kind of a summary of everything that we've observed through our quarterly monitoring that we do with our uprising team, through our monitoring that we do through federal programs, and then just all the reporting and everything that we collect throughout the year. And we use that data to determine what is the anticipated risk of a school in a federal program area for the next year. There are 5 federal program areas that we look at: homeless, foster, migrant students, parent-family engagement, English learners, immigrant students, special education, and finance. And so the risk assessment assigns a school in each of those 5 program areas a risk tier, 1 through 3. 1 being lower risk and 3 being higher risk. And so then we use those tiers to communicate to the schools what monitoring they will be required to have in the following year, as well as what supports that we can provide for them. And so this is kind of a breakdown just on the 2 special population areas we're talking about today. in terms of where our schools landed in our first year of assigning these tiers. So when we look at English learners, we had one school, and these are schools that were in operation last year in our district, one school that's a tier 1, 11 schools that are tier 2, and one school that is tier 3. And across the board, where we saw schools earning the most kind of like risk points that led to these tier determinations were their data on the EL assessments, the desktop monitoring findings I talked about when we reviewed their ILPs, and then staff attrition and the experience of their EL coordinators. So those areas were where most of our schools earned most of the points that pushed them into those higher tier levels. When looking at special education, we had 0 schools in tier 1, 6 in tier 2, and 7 in tier 3. And the areas where we saw most schools earning points was, again, our desktop monitoring findings and IEPs, as well as findings that we discovered through site visits and issues with timeline compliance, completing those documents and the timelines that the federal government provides for them. So some takeaways here. One is this isn't surprising to us. This really aligns with what we were seeing through our quarterly monitoring. Generally a school that has a tier 3 probably did not meet on their SPF, or they were on the border. And so we did see alignment between how we're assessing schools on the SPF. It also aligns with where we received more of our findings through the results-based monitoring process. And also compared to the other 3 federal program areas, these 2 have a much more rigorous threshold to be tier 1. And we felt that was appropriate because we want to make sure that in our district, all means all. We want to make sure that we're supporting our schools to serve all of our students, and these are areas that we know across charter schools in general, there are more supports needed sometimes. So we want to make sure that our schools understand what the requirements are and have the tools necessary to get there. So these tier levels are more skewed to 2 and 3 than the other program areas, but we feel like this is appropriate looking ahead to next year and where we wanted to provide more supports. And last slide here, key takeaways looking ahead. The risk assessment, like I said, it provided a really reliable baseline of data that we saw kind of correspond to our other monitoring that we did throughout the year, including the SPF, the results-based monitoring, and just what we were observing through working with our schools. We're excited to use this data to differentiate our supports. We have more people. We want to make sure that what we are creating for our schools is useful. And so that's something that I feel like we can really do with this data now in front of us. And then also, the data that we collected to determine tiers is going to be in a report that's shared with schools. And so we've already heard feedback from them. They're excited about having a breakdown of how this is calculated and being able to speak internally with their teams for where they can identify areas of growth are so that they can specifically focus on their own development and how they can reduce the risk and increase compliance across the board. And that's it. If I have to take any other questions you all might have.
I just want to add before I turn it back over, Chair Richards and I talked about this presentation and tomorrow's presentation on federal grants as just an opportunity to do a deep dive with the commission on our responsibilities as a school district. And these are incredibly important responsibilities. We spend a whole lot of time on this. And so I know this was a lot of information. It was weedy, but I just want you all to know that the team spends a lot of time caring about these areas and that we take these areas very seriously. And then we work with our schools to take them seriously too. And so just appreciate Nate and the team. I think it was Kelly Croneman who said joining the commission is like jumping on a treadmill that's running, and you just gotta like get on the treadmill and start running. And that's the work, and just appreciate all of the new team. You're a year in and you're still here. Yay. And we have a new team member to support the work.
And Wendy Tucker would be proud that we continue focusing on
She was
these
behind
issues. That's right.
my ask for this because in my heart I could still hear her saying,
okay.
saying, all right. My biggest concern with this is I appreciate and can't tell you thank you enough for the work, especially in the special populations, and of course all the work that Trent, you and your team do as well. But the thing that is frightening to me is the amount of this that is paperwork And I really, like, you know, I see, okay, they have an IEP, we've checked to make sure they have it, we checked to make sure it meets all the requirements. But the real part that bothers me is how much of this is actually translating to improved educational experience for these kids. You know, are we really better off with, you know, the teachers and the English learning, or would we be better off just putting these kids in front of a TV set and letting them learn English, watching English TV, which is the way most children learn English? I hate to say that, but quite frankly, it's the truth. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work and cost, and particularly where they don't pay for it the first year. I mean, to me, I just want to throw my hands up if I were trying to start a charter school. Because you know, you want to serve the population, you're committed to kids, but this is just mind-bogglingly difficult, and I appreciate y'all's hard work and everybody's patience as we went through this, because it is hard to do.
We can't request one. I would love to just see a TASER study on how much resources is spent on filling out reports of things we're already checking.
Mhm.
Like, I think it would be staggering across the state of how much money is spent just to fill out some bureaucrat's form.
It doesn't
I
really
will
improve
say that,
anything.
what I mentioned in the risk assessment, this is one area where as a district, we're trying to respond to the idea of like, how can we reduce, how do we make sure that we're not adding any additional burden on our schools? And so this is an area where when you come to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, that if you are trending towards like compliance, that we are basically doing as little as possible.
As possible.
And so like Katie last year did quarterly monitoring for all schools and TM polls. And so for next year, if you're tier 1, then you only have 1 quarter of monitoring. And that's also for us as a district, as we scale up, we need to make sure the work's sustainable and we're putting our resources where they're needed. But we are sensitive to that, and you know, there is a lot of paperwork that we have to do, but we're trying our best to make sure that we're not passing that on to schools unless absolutely necessary.
Well, and where it comes from me, and this goes back to when Paul Deggs, who was one of the assistant commissioners with TDOT, I asked him once, I said, you know, if we got rid of all federal funding, what would it do? And right off the bat, he said it knocked 4 years and 40% off of every road project that we do. Well, we get 50% of our funding from the feds, but we have to comply with 100% of the rules. What are they actually putting on us that's costing money that no one's actually done the research on, you know, to see what is it actually adding up to, and is it worth the amount of funding that we're getting, or is it actually causing us to spend so much of the money we're getting on these things just to comply with their rules? That's where it's more going, not so much what we're putting on schools, but it's what's being put on the state, which is filtering down to being put on top of us.
Well, we appreciate, Katie, particularly your thorough.
I know,
approach to
everybody up there was
this.
just like, we're not speaking on that one.
No, it's a quintessential age-old problem of, you know, you've got to meet the requirements if you're going to take the money. But this is the thing that at night keeps me up, is are we going to get found that we are completely missing some part of our compliance responsibilities? So that's why we ask for these updates. And it's more, not that we have any doubt about what y'all are doing. You have our complete confidence. But I think as an exercise of our oversight responsibilities, we have to have the conversation. So we appreciate it, and sorry. We wish the world was different.
Well, on that note, thank you all for your attendance and participation in this meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. Just to echo what Chair Richards said, I mean, this is a heavy lift, and we appreciate it.
It's a real heavy lift.
I'd like to ask if there are any final comments from commissioners.
I have a question.
Jamie,
Since you have a special microphone here, are you gonna sing for us?
I didn't want to have to hold it for 2 hours.
No. And that's it. The committee is currently scheduled for October 17th, 2024. Maybe singing at that particular committee. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Ayes have it, and we're adjourned. Thank you.